So time to talk big. Today, we're not going to look at a specific market. We're going to look at something that you need to understand to really understand any specific gold making method. And it's a little bit theoretical, but I think it's going to be great. And the point that we're going to look at today is the fact that market behavior or markets don't really exist. Market behavior is just an aggregate of player behavior. Now, some of you are going to be like, what are you talking about? And of course, it's a little bit theoretical. And the point here is that the market is an abstraction. It doesn't actually exist as a person or entity. It's just a sum total of market interactions by market participants. So what does that mean in a World of Warcraft context? It means when I'm posting stuff on the auction house, I'm participating in the market. And the market reflects my actions on the auction house. And the thing I think a lot of people are making some mistakes about is thinking that they need to understand the market as an entity or the market as the sum aggregate of player behavior. But that's not really what's important to understand for newer gold makers. That's not where you start out. Where you start out is by focusing on specific player behavior, specific players, or rather, what does another player want or need? And that's what you need to optimize for. You need to remember that you're always optimizing for a person, someone sitting on the other side of the screen who decides to buy your auctions. So you need to understand what's going to make people more likely to buy your auctions. What do people like? That means understanding what items they like. And then for a single given item, it needs to be understood when are they more likely to buy this item? How much of this item do they buy at a time? These are the important things. And we're going to look at some examples of places where I see people sort of where the wisdom, or rather people have some ideas that I don't think they've considered fully. Now, one of these is the fact, and this is something I've harped on time and time again and will harp on forever. Some people disagree with me vehemently. Doing large undercut is not stupid, and it never will be stupid. It's a good idea in the right circumstances. And the reason is very simple. There's a limited number of players, and you will understand this if you look at individual players. There's a limited number of players interested in buying an item at a given price point. That's just a fact of life. So by driving the price down, you might either entice more players to buy, or you might entice players to buy more if they're already buying. So for instance, if I see that flasks today are 20% lower than average, and I was going to buy a flask for my M Plus run, then maybe I'll buy a full stack because they're cheaper. And suddenly you've sold 20 flasks instead of one. And that happens. That's a real thing. I've observed it in so many different markets. If you drive the price down, you get more sales. There's no buts, no ifs. That's just the truth. And people think that the market can absorb infinite amounts at any price. They'll be like, there's no point in doing this. The market, you can just sell them just as fast at a given price point. And that depends completely on your repost patterns. But just if you think about the fact that there are actual real players buying your auctions, you'll very quickly understand why lowering the price can lead to more sales. Now, another example. This one more people understand. But this is a technique, and this is sort of why a technique works. On Classic, we have stack sizing on the auction house. We can put items, we can sell them in stacks of 10, stacks of 5, stacks of 20. And when we had this in retail, I used this technique, and I used it in Classic. It's fantastic for alchemy. I sell alchemy consumables in every possible stack size from 1 to 5. And I treat each of these stack sizes independently, pricing-wise. So for my 2 stacks, I'll only undercut other stacks of 2. And 3 stacks, I'll only undercut other stacks of 3. And that's because these stack sizes appeal to different players. I am targeting different players. I'm targeting players who need or want exactly this amount of consumables for tonight's raid, or for tonight's dungeon, or for whatever reason. And if they are starved for gold and just need 2 flasks, then they might be willing to pay 20% more for per flask if they can just get 2, because that's still going to be less gold than buying 3 flasks. And if they can't afford 3 flasks, then they might just buy my 2, even though they're marked up 10-20%. And that's the logic. So even if there is like one overall market for flasks or mongoose elixirs, I'm not selling in the overall market. I'm selling in to specific players who want a specific stack size. I'm not trying to be the... Because if I was just looking at the market, then maybe I'd just undercut the cheapest auction regardless of stack size. Then I'd be leaving tons of gold on the table. Because the people are buying a 5 stack, they might not be... they might not care absolutely the most about getting the cheapest per unit price. Maybe they just want to save time. Buy all the 5 consumables. Maybe they're buying multiple stacks. They buy 3 stacks of 5 and they're done. Instead of buying 15 stacks of 1, that takes a lot more time. That's 5 times as much time on the auction house and collecting mail. At some point, that's just not worth the time. So once again, we're not focusing on like what is the optimal way to approach the specific, or what is the market right now, or whatever. Looking at it from the point of view that there are different players with different wants and needs, and we're going to try to sell so that we are the most useful, the best auction to as many different players as possible, and that they are going to want to buy my auctions. So the mistake people here, that a lot of people do, is that they focus on the aggregate behavior as trying to, well, like, you need to understand the market, you need to look at prices and trends and whatever. And that's not what you should start with. You should start with understanding why players buy the item. Why is this useful? What is useful to other players? That's the big question, because the items that are useful to other players, that's the most profitable items in the game. What's the most useful item in all of Shadowlands? Legendaries. What's been the most profitable item to craft in all of Shadowlands? Legendaries. That's it. You need to understand what players value. That's way more important than trying to like micromanage the profits of alchemy by looking at the Undermined Journal graphs of herbs. That's a way to profits, but it's way easier to just buy all the materials, craft one of each legendary, slam them on the auction house, and go to bed. And wake up to selling, well, you sold 1/10 of them maybe. And you just do it again, instead of trying to min-max your pricing all day. And this is the way to profit in general. Understand what players value. So some recent examples. Missives. Get the right stats on your 262 gear, you can double your price. Focusing on the most popular legendary slots. Craft those, don't do the others. Identify useful items ahead of time by understanding what do players value. Being strong. Then get those recipes and get them to players. The question you always should focus on is what do WoW players need, what do they want, not what is the market, what does the pricing structure look like. All that is fluff. Understand what players need, and then find ways to get cheap materials, craft the useful items, and get them onto the auction house for more than you paid for the materials. That's literally how simple it is. That's what I did with legendaries and 262 gear. Nothing fancy. Just sell them for at least 20% more than you paid for the materials, and you're good to go. Now, understanding the market, or sort of the understanding of the market that's important, in my opinion, is to understand sort of how behavior changes over time and how that might lead to changes in price, supply, and demand. But that's secondary. That's secondary. First, you need to understand what players want so you can target the right items. And then once you're in those items, then you can maybe start trying to min-max and optimize and get that last 10% extra profit by understanding how the aggregate market moves with things like the weekly cycle. Players buy a lot more consumables on reset days because that's when more guilds raid and more players do more M+ runs, dungeons reset, all of that jazz. That's like the next step. That's once you've understood why a market is good, or why a particular, when I say market now, I mean an item or a specific niche or a specific crafting profession. As I said, the important part here, understand and focus on players. Everything else will just follow. Don't sit looking at the Undermined Journal. Seriously. You're way better off reading a PvE guide. Read a class guide. Figure out what items are suggested by the class guide writers, and then figure out if you can craft any of those, then start crafting those. That's a way better way to riches than looking at the Undermined Journal graphs. I can promise you that. So seriously, don't stress so much about like understanding the market, whatever. The market is just player behavior, so just focus on doing stuff that's useful to other players, and then you can make gold. Thanks for watching.